There's a story we don't talk about often. Not the story of what happened, but the story of what happens after. Survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence are often asked to relive their trauma, to talk about what happened, to justify their reactions, to answer impossible questions like, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you report it? Why didn't you just leave? But no one talks about the after. No one talks about what it feels like to wake up in a body that no longer feels like your own. No one talks about what it feels like to be in familiar places that now feel like minefields. No one talks about how everyday moments are interrupted by memories you never invited. No one talks about how trauma doesn't just live in the past. No, trauma lingers. It lingers in the body, in the brain, in the way that survivors experience their everyday lives. And just like so many others, I have heard the same myths. You just have to move on. Time heals all wounds. You're strong, you'll get over it. But trauma isn't something that you can just get over. Trauma changes you. Trauma rewires your brain. We like to think of trauma as an emotional experience, but at its core, trauma is biological. Trauma rewires neural pathways, making everyday life feel unsafe, unpredictable, and overwhelming for survivors. These changes aren't just temporary. They are deeply ingrained in the brain's structure and in the way that survivors experience their everyday lives. So how exactly does trauma impact the brain? First, we have the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of like the brain's alarm system. It's responsible for detecting threats and for triggering the brain's fight or flight response. Trauma is also responsible for flooding the brain with stress hormones when it sees danger. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. But when trauma occurs, especially repeated trauma, the brain becomes hyperactive, almost like a smoke alarm that goes off even if there's no smoke or fire. The amygdala goes into overdrive, and survivors can feel as if danger is lurking right behind them or right in front of them. A loud noise, an unexpected touch, or even a familiar scent can send the survivor back to the moment when that trauma occurred. This sense of fear is a neurological reaction. Because when the amygdala is in overdrive, it overrides the brain's reaction to make sense of what has happened. This brings us to the hippocampus. The hippocampus is kind of like the brain's filing system. It's responsible for organizing, storing, and retrieving memories. It's also responsible for telling the brain that a certain event is over and that you're safe in the present. But when trauma occurs, this process gets disrupted. The hippocampus believes that you're still in the moment when that trauma occurred, that you never left, and as if you are experiencing that trauma again in real time. Survivors can feel confused. They can have extensive flashbacks, vivid memories, and even memory loss. Because the hippocampus not only fails to process these memories correctly, it also starts losing memory files. Research has also showed that when trauma occurs, especially repeated trauma, the hippocampus can shrink in size. This can cause problems with emotional regulation, in processing memories, in distinguishing between real danger and perceived threats. And when the hippocampus is fragmented, it can also make rational decisions hard. This brings us to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for making sense of a situation, then assessing the risks of that situation, and then coming up with appropriate decisions based on those risks. But when trauma occurs, the prefrontal cortex also becomes impaired. Survivors can have a hard time thinking critically, can have a hard time thinking rationally, can have a hard time processing their emotions, controlling their impulses, a whole array of items. When trauma occurs, the person has a hard time making good decisions. It's kind of like if a survivor were to go up to a spinner and were to spin the wheel for every single time they had to make a decision. There's no logic behind the reasoning. It's just spinning a wheel, and whatever it says, you're basing your life off of it. That's what survivors face on a day-to-day basis. When the amygdala is in overdrive, the hippocampus is fragmented, and the prefrontal cortex is weakened, survivors find themselves in a constant state of survival mode. You can kind of think of it like this. It's like you walk into a room, and there's constant sirens going on. Someone's making you relive the worst memories of your life, and then you're having to spin a wheel for every decision. Decisions that could make or break your life. That's what survivors go through on a daily basis. Because they not only survived the traumatic event, they're also having to survive their brain being impaired. So all of this sounds kind of awful. It sounds like a doomsday situation. But the good news is healing is possible. Neuroscience tells us that trauma can impair the brain, but it also tells us that the brain can repair itself. Our first step, we have to calm the amygdala. So how do we calm the amygdala? Well, survivors need spaces where they don't have to constantly be on guard, where they don't have to constantly defend themselves, justify their reactions, or explain their pain. Survivors need spaces where they can just exist. This is why I help organize several events at Georgia State for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. I've seen what happens when survivors step into these places. I've seen the burden ease from their shoulders. I've seen their breathing start to slow down, the constant flickering of the room, the constant instinctive flinches at sudden noises, they all begin to fade. Because healing begins the moment a survivor is able to just exhale. But trauma isn't only about fear. It's also about memory. So this brings us back to the hippocampus. So how do we rewire the hippocampus? Well, trauma thrives in silence, but healing happens in communities. Healing happens the second you're willing to sit down with someone and listen to their story. Neuroscience tells us that speaking our truths can reshape our brain. And when we start telling our stories, and when survivors start telling their stories, the hippocampus begins to make sense of what has happened. The trauma stops feeling like an open wound and starts feeling like a narrative, one that a survivor has control over. For years, I've worked with an organization in Atlanta that provides resources for survivors of sex trafficking. And when I sit down with these survivors, I see this happen in real time. I see the way that the survivors' shoulders, their posture changes, the way that they stand up just a little bit taller, because they realize that someone is listening to them, someone believes them, that someone is there for them. Because healing doesn't happen just in solitude. Healing happens in communities. And now finally, we're at the prefrontal cortex. So how do we strengthen the prefrontal cortex? Well, the answer is really simple. You need the right tools. Therapy, trauma-informed care, and community support can strengthen the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, neuroscience research shows that therapy and trauma-informed care can improve synaptic plasticity. Synaptic plasticity is kind of like nerve connections. They are the connections in your brain that all work together. Trauma-informed care and therapy can improve synaptic connectivity, and this can help survivors heal faster and help them heal faster from their trauma. So honestly, it's just 3 simple things. You have to calm the amygdala, you have to rewire the hippocampus, and you have to strengthen the prefrontal cortex. But unfortunately, society makes healing very difficult. Instead of creating safety in order to calm the amygdala, society questions survivors. Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you fight back? Even though trauma can cause the brain to freeze. Instead of listening to survivor stories, society dismisses them. Why didn't you report it? Even though reporting can cause nothing but re-traumatization. Instead of giving survivors the right access to resources in order to help their prefrontal cortex, society blames them for struggling. That happened so long ago, why are you still caught up on it? Even though trauma can change the brain. Society punishes survivors for their trauma and then questions why they haven't healed yet. We have to change the conversation. Instead of saying, why haven't you moved on? Instead say, I'm here for you, no matter how much time has passed. Instead of asking, why didn't you report it? Instead say, why does society make reporting so difficult? Instead of saying, why didn't you leave? Instead say, why do abusers get away with it? Because the way we treat survivors literally changes their brain. Being a survivor means learning to live in a world that wasn't designed for you, and then daring to change that very world. But here's what I know. Healing is possible, not just because survivors are strong, but because the brain is resilient. And every time we believe a survivor, we connect a dot. Every time we change a harmful narrative, we connect a dot. Every time we create safety, we connect a dot. Until we stop seeing survivors as isolated stories and start seeing them as part of a bigger story, one that demands a brighter future. A future where survivors don't just survive, they thrive. A future where healing isn't possible, it's expected. A future where no one has to rebuild alone. The dots are right in front of us, and it's up to us to connect them. Thank you. Thank you.